Welcome to TrialSite News Podcast Series. Today we have Matthew Amsden joining us. Matthew is the CEO and founder of ProofPilot. He has 20 years of experience planning, designing, and managing complex online research experiences. Now, New York-based ProofPilot was launched in 2014 to make clinical trials easier to set up and run, not to mention elicit participation by making them fun. Now, with ProofPilot, anyone can design a research study. You don't have to have a PhD. And with more rigorous studies, we get more and better answers that improve our health care, based on evidence. ProofPilot is a privately held and has raised at least $1.85 million in venture funding from CueBall Capital and Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. So Matthew, thank you. It's an honor to have you joining us with the TrialSite News Podcast Series.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, the pleasure is ours. Now, just going to jump right into this. How did the idea for ProofPilot come about? We know that experience with early virtual trials among gay men influenced the founding of the company, and we would enjoy hearing how it started.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually not a researcher by background or training. Like a lot of people who support research, I kind of fell into this line of work. I was working at a big East Coast consulting firm for public policy and healthcare-oriented efforts, and I was doing a lot of research dissemination at that point, working with researchers, taking those big 300-page reports that the government often commissions and turning them into bite-sized pieces that could be read, used, and applied at the local level. It wasn't very long after I started my career that a number of Western governments, so most of Western Europe and most of the Western Hemisphere, identified HIV as a solvable issue. Sounds a little naive now, but they kind of figured, we know it causes HIV, we know how to prevent HIV, so if we throw up a bunch of stuff up against the wall, maybe we'll figure out which ones work. So as part of the 2008 Reinvestment Act, there was a lot of money for HIV prevention research. The thing is that the techniques that researchers had used for decades in other disease states, all clinic-based oriented settings, didn't really work for HIV prevention studies for a couple of reasons. The primary one, they were going after a technology early adopter audience who saw almost no incentive for being involved in a research study. Secondarily, the locations in which researchers had traditionally recruited gay and bisexual men, hookup parks, gay bars, sex clubs, were largely closing because that entire population was moving online. And finally, there was a significant disincentive for a lot of the individuals that these researchers were targeting to be involved in research studies. Obviously, in some parts of the country, there was the concern of being outed by going to a clinic-based setting where there were lots of other LGBT individuals. And also, in most cases, the population considered themselves invincible. They were 25-year-old kids who figured it was a lot more fun to go to the beach on a weekday evening than to go into a city to some clinic. So these researchers, they were noting that something needed to change. And this was about 10 years or so ago now. They saw that what I was doing in research dissemination, I was doing a lot of this dissemination online. And they came to me and said, we see you doing this stuff on blogs and on websites, which at that point, people just thought those things were incredibly unique and different. Can you recruit a couple of people for us for some of these studies because we can't do it the old-fashioned way? And I shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. And fast forward a little bit, and they'd say, you're doing really well recruiting these people with banner ads and stuff like that. Can you actually collect a little data for us as well? Shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. To the point by 2011, 2012, we were doing large-scale randomized control trials almost completely online. And that's really where the genesis of ProofPilot kind of came into play. What was really kind of fortuitous about this is that we were working with a technology early adopter research group because we were targeting a technology early adopter participant group. And it's been since then that a much broader portion of our population has moved online in very dramatic ways.
So is this then how you got into the world of clinical trials?
With every one of these efforts in the HIV space, I don't think I'm being over dramatic when I say they were complete unmitigated management disasters. quite literally, all we were doing was layering a technology development process on top of the already fraught process of planning a trial. These trials in the early phases didn't necessarily have a biomedical element associated with them. Internally, we called them behavioral trials. We were testing different things to change people's behaviors. But because it was so difficult to actually develop these protocols, and then so difficult to develop the protocols, it made success in the process really difficult. Researchers were still designing the studies around themselves, and then they were putting them out to participants and wondering why participants felt like a cow jabbed with treatments and milked for data. There were all of these inconsistently applied regulations across different institutions. It made success in these efforts almost impossible. So before every one of these efforts, we figured, we're doing behavioral trials here, sure, but there are tens of thousands of trials that are run in the United States every single year. There must be a solution out there that makes this process easier, that creates a participant-centered orientation, still gives researchers the things that they need. And there wasn't one. So the very beginning impetus of ProofPilot was a solution for ourselves. And about the same time all of this was happening, we're talking 2013, 2014 here, a number of other kinds of researchers started to contact ProofPilot as well. Some of them were clinical trials, some of them were social service evaluations. They were all essentially some form of interventional longitudinal human subjects research studies. And they were saying, you know what, we've got this research question, we've got this clinical trial that we want to run, and we want to do it online because our populations have moved on online as well. And we'd say, sure, let's do it. And that really is how ProofPilot merged into become what it is today, which is an organization that supports lots of different kinds of clinical trials. We don't limit ourselves just to pharma, though pharma is obviously one of our largest industry groups. It is about any kind of human subjects research study that is trying to identify the answer to a research question. Most of them are clinical trials, but a small portion are not.
Fantastic. Now we know that traditional world of clinical trials is dominated by big pharma and CROs. Yet there is another branch of research involving health centers, wellness studies, etc. Can big pharma learn from these folks?
Yeah, so very interesting trajectory for ProofPilot in the early years. We did become a company during the heyday of venture capital, so we literally were able to raise a small amount of money relatively quickly. But very early on after that raise, it became clear to us that pharma was not going to be an early adopter of our technologies. We were told, and I believe this very, very thoroughly, there's so much risk in the biological elements that pharma puts out there that they have to de-risk everything else. And that meant that a small venture-backed company probably is not going to be someone that they're going to choose right out of the gate for their phase 3 clinical trial to go to the FDA. So in order for us to build momentum and to learn, we actually focused in other industries. So those industries included the health and wellness sector, supplement sector, the cosmetic sector. And in many cases, those industries, because they didn't have the culture nor the history of doing clinical trials in certain ways, they made a decision to use ProofPilot in a consumer-focused orientation. And by that, I mean they were much more willing to be consumer-centered, so participant-centered. They were much more willing to use different techniques to recruit participants, to engage those participants in studies, to provide information back to participants while they were in the study. Some of the most dramatic shifts that we have seen and that we have learned in clinical trials from the health and wellness sector shows us that financial compensation for participation isn't absolutely necessary anymore. In fact, for some individuals, it's actually a disincentive. Instead, we see those individuals are very much defined by their interest in helping science or discovering new things about themselves. A financial compensation does help a certain set of individuals, but not necessarily all of them. So we learned to adjust to that in a space that was much more willing to kind of break down barriers and do things a little differently because they didn't have the history of doing trials in a certain way.
So, evolving models in the world of clinical trials, could you talk to our audience about the advent of hybrid trials and how they compare with virtual trials versus site-focused ones?
Sure. So literally everyone we speak to when we first start talking about ProofPilot assumes that we are a virtual trial platform. And we do support some virtual trials. And by virtual trials, I mean those trials that are completely and totally online. Some people use the word virtual, some people use the word remote, and there's a whole bunch of buzz around it. The reality, however, is that when you're talking about most health initiatives, whether it is a pharmaceutical trial or whether it is a social service trial or whether it's a public health trial, there are a lot of things that require an interpersonal connection between a study professional, whether they're a clinician or a volunteer or a site worker, and the participant themselves. So ProofPilot actually considers ourselves to be a hybrid study platform. And by hybrid, I mean those situations and those trials that allow participants to do certain things at home, at their own convenience in their whatever location works for them, and certain tasks that require an interpersonal interaction between that participant and a study professional in a clinic-based setting or somewhere else where they come together in real time. Those two kinds of trials, I think that in the pharma space specifically at the moment, there's a lot of confusion about what these things mean. It is our view at ProofPilot that a vast majority of study activities in a traditional site-based model probably can move to be done remotely. However, we under no circumstances believe that trial site activities are going to go away entirely. If you're in an oncology trial, it's just not realistic. Everything is going to be done at home. If you need to be seen by a physician to have certain kinds of blood drawn, to have certain assessments, that's not going to all happen at home. But there may be a large portion of trial activities that can be done in remote fashions. And so we believe, much the same way that we saw retail over the past half decade or so, move to that cross-channel approach where you could go to Best Buy and you could pick something up that you ordered at home. We see the same thing in the same modalities likely happening within clinical trials. Someone wants to have their A1C checked at home. We certainly can ship a test out to them so they can do it at home. Do they prefer to go into a Quest Direct clinic and have it done by a professional? Great. Can an oncology patient in a trial answer some self-assessments at home as opposed to going into a clinic? Sure. Do they need to go into the clinic for some kinds of treatments? Absolutely. It really is a cross-channel world, and ProofPilot is really tried to orient itself to support those modalities that require an in-person and remote activities.
Right, plus you're expanding your audience. Not everyone wants to go in for every little thing, and specifically with the millennial and the iGen generations coming up, it's going to be a big deal to be able to do both.
Yeah, and right now we're right in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. Everyone's talking about 100% remote trials. And God willing, we won't all be at home all the time forever. I do think that we are shifting some of the thinking, but we need to be careful about going too far. It's simply not realistic to have trials be 100% virtual. We have a very small portion of ProofPilot trials that are, but a vast majority includes some kind of interpersonal activity.
Right. And so with COVID-19 pandemic, do you see some of these trends intensifying?
Yeah. The trends in the health and wellness sector for trials had been moving in this direction much faster than they had in academia or pharma, though there had been a lot of conversation in academia and pharma about trials moving online. Every conference that I went to, there was always a track about remote trials. There's lots of press in industry trade journals about these kinds of things. There are lots of investments in companies like ProofPilot and some of our ancillaries. However, there had been very few that had actually gotten off the ground. Despite the fact that I think most trials are actually going to be hybrid trials in the future, I do believe that this particular unique situation in our history that we're in is forcing some of those conversations to think about at least a partially remote trial or hybrid trial in the future. Most of the organizations that ProofPilot works with at the moment, The studies that are run on ProofPilot that are virtual are the only ones operating at the moment. By that, I mean large academic institutions, large pharma organizations. A vast majority of their traditional in-clinic trials are shut down, except for those that are either in oncology or are showing incredible results for individuals who require life-saving treatments. Otherwise, early stuff that is maybe on the edge of showing efficacy, stuff that maybe is more exploratory in nature, academic trials, all shut down. That is a huge business interruption to a set of industries that are basically live and die based on trial results. So we do hear the beginning of a drumbeat that it's getting much, much louder towards moving that conversation, that set of conversations around remote and hybrid trials to reality in a way that perhaps before things were a little bit slow and just chatter.
Right. So how do you see ProofPoint adding value into the evolving ecosystem as research models change?
So one of the things where we don't see that we're going to add value, and this is very controversial within, I think, the industry at the moment, is there are a lot of organizations that are spouting, it's COVID-19, everything's got to be done at home. We are now going to be a remote trial platform. ProofPilot doesn't feel that like this is the right time to kind of shift entire model and start marketing. We also have been very careful about the kinds of organizations that have COVID-19 activities that we want to run trials on. I think for an organization like ProofPilot and for other companies like us, this is an opportunity to help where we can, but at the same time, really step back for a moment and think about what the future is going to hold. And for us, what ProofPilot feels the future is going to be is a fairly dramatic shift towards new trials, including at least some online activities to support mostly phase 3 and phase 4 efforts. How fast that happens really depends on the kind of economic disruption that we're looking at across the world at the moment. But at least the conversations that we've had over the past couple of weeks and then progressing towards the past 2 weeks or so, that shift probably will happen relatively fast within a couple of early adopter organizations. And then probably 2 years from now, we will look back at what's happening now as that point that shifted movement towards a hybrid and clinical trial model much more aggressively than it had before.
So what is ProofPilot's business models?
Sure. So ProofPilot is very unique. We are not project-based. We feel very strongly that an organization should use ProofPilot to essentially solve the research replication crisis. So we price based on the number of researchers who use the platform. And by researchers, we mean individuals who design a study and individuals who support participants in that study. Otherwise, it is an unlimited number of studies for an unlimited number of participants. We want to see organizations running studies in various different time points with various different populations, maybe asking a same or very similar question. That to us is very important, and we have been very involved in replicating research studies where we've been allowed to do so and funded to do so, and we feel very strongly that we should be doing more of that. I think, again, the COVID-19 crisis is actually showing these things in hyper time, where a study comes out from France and it gets replicated very quickly in another location, and the results don't hold up. We should be doing that across a whole variety of different disease states and research issues, and we don't necessarily do that now. So we hope by making the business model as ProofPilot is doing so, will support more of that research replication than is being done now.
So what is the future of ProofPilot? How will you know that you've been successful?
Sure. So there's obviously all the business stuff that will identify success or lack thereof. But to us, I think that there's a broader success metric that we talk a lot about with our investors and our stakeholders. And that is, we need more evidence about what works and what doesn't to improve human health. When you look at roundtables that are funded by the US government or other interagency organizations, a very small set of what we do for health, particularly in the United States, but it's not limited here, it's worldwide, actually has evidence to suggest that it actually works. In fact, there is a 2006, I believe, maybe it's 2007, research roundtable that was conducted by the Institute of Medicine, which is the US Congressional Research Service, that brought a whole bunch of researchers and industry experts from a whole bunch of different healthcare organizations. And the outcome of that particular session is that only 50 to 80% of what we do in US hospitals has sufficient evidence to suggest it works. And our health outcomes in the United States, huge amounts of money we spend on healthcare, we don't necessarily have the best health outcomes in the world. That suggests to me that there's a lot of opportunity to build evidence, just in the traditional spaces where we're supposed to be doing evidence-based medicine. But most health actually happens outside of a hospital setting. Most health is actually around prevention and health optimization. As humans, there's very little that we're more curious about than ourselves. What works, what doesn't, why do we do it this way? What happens if we make a change? Our brains are wired to do that sort of thing on a one-by-one basis.
Right.
My hope is, from a success perspective, beyond the financial stuff, is that ProofPilot can usher in a renaissance in evidence-based practice. And I know evidence has a kind of political connotation and term associated with it now. To ProofPilot, there is no kind of political orientation to it. It is what works and what doesn't. Because research is so expensive now, it's not uncommon for one research study to be done in a very specific time point in a very specific setting. Right. So let's take some of those HIV studies that we used to do. At that particular time, it was very common to do those studies in major East and West Coast urban areas, because that's where the money was and that's where the populations to recruit those participants were. Fast forward a couple of years, those jurisdictions, they'd largely had infrastructures set up to manage the HIV epidemic in the best way that they possibly could. The epidemic started to move to areas in the southeast component of the United States, areas that are dramatically different than South Central Los Angeles or the Bronx or Manhattan or San Francisco. Yet the same research studies that were identifying what worked in those populations were being slapped down wholesale into places like Bangor, Maine, or Jackson, Mississippi, or Tulsa, Oklahoma. And because it was a dramatically different culture and a dramatically different environment with a dramatically different population, that evidence-based practice didn't work.
Right.
So we end up in a situation where someone kind of rolls their eyes when they hear about evidence-based practice. In my view, coming back to that question that you asked about what does success mean for ProofPilot, it means continually testing these studies in various different populations, bringing the costs down for research enough so that Tulsa, Oklahoma and Bangor, Maine can take what they think might work from that original study or that original evidence-based practice that was validated in Bronx, New York, and change it enough and run their own evaluations. Right now, that's not really possible. And so we have this kind of cynicism around evidence base. So when we talk about a renaissance in evidence-based practice, it is not just running studies in the same locations on the same topics over and over and over again. It is about reducing the barriers so a vastly larger group of individuals can create much more targeted, much more, for lack of a better way to put it, personalized solutions for whatever their topic happens to be. And by the way, that topic, I hope, isn't just let's solve issues that are already there, but also topics and research studies that actually look at prevention and health optimization.
Agreed.
That is where real health will happen.
So, we appreciate your time with us here. But if you have any final thoughts about ProofPilot for the TrialSite News audience, we'd love to hear it.
ProofPilot is a business, and I think that's obvious. However, it is a business with a social mission, and that social mission expands across the pharma industry into the health and wellness sector, into the social service organizations. And yes, ProofPilot is an online tool, though we do support a lot of studies that are offline as well. Our mission is really to make studies that weren't possible before possible. at price points that weren't necessarily available in the past. That doesn't mean that we don't do the large-scale pharma trials that have been done for many years, nor does it mean that we kind of leave out R01-funded research studies. What it does mean is that we hope it opens up those organizations to much more dramatically and much faster complete those studies and get those results out to individuals who can benefit from those results faster, and at the same time open up the world to evidence and to trials that haven't had the opportunity to do so before. So again, what I'd end with here is that yes, ProofPilot is a business, but it is a business with a social and mission orientation to it that we feel is very important, particularly in light of the experience that we're all dealing with today. We've got to invest more in what prevents disease, what optimizes health, and be much faster about bringing solutions to the market and to the population than we are now.
Well, we definitely wish you all the best of luck, and we thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been enlightening to be able to talk with you about ProofPilot, and we're excited to see how this continues to evolve. So, Matthew, thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.